Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
There's a certain heaviness that settles into your gut when something feels off before it even starts. That strange sixth sense that whispers, this isn't going to end well, but you keep moving forward anyway because you want to believe, just once, that your instincts are wrong. That's how I felt the moment I pulled into my parents' driveway that Sunday afternoon. The sun was shining, the breeze was soft, and yet everything in me felt like it was bracing for a storm that hadn't quite rolled in yet. They'd called it a family gathering, one of those generic, open-ended invitations that could mean anything from a surprise birthday party to some vague health update no one wanted to text about. I even tried to guess on the drive over. Maybe Dad was finally going to tell us about that knee surgery he'd been avoiding, or maybe Mom had put together some kind of legacy video project, the kind she'd always talked about but never followed through on. Hell, for half a second, I even wondered if they were going to announce they'd prepaid their funeral expenses, something morbid but responsible, very on brand for them. What I didn't expect was what actually happened. I walked in to find my siblings already there, which should have been my first clue. Kelsey was perched on the edge of the couch, legs crossed, acrylic nails tapping against her wine glass like a metronome. David stood near the window, arms folded, pretending not to check his watch every 10 seconds like he always did when he thought the rest of us were wasting his time. Our parents were seated together at the dining table, looking far too pleased with themselves for people who were supposedly delivering some kind of announcement. "Everyone's here," Mom said, clapping her hands together in that overly rehearsed way she always did when she was about to launch into something she'd practiced in front of the mirror. "Good. Let's sit down." I still remember the exact moment the air changed in the room, the second my father pulled out a thick manila envelope and laid it on the table like it was a damn party favor. He cleared his throat, eyes darting toward my mother like he was waiting for her cue. "We wanted to talk to you all today about the estate," he said, trying to sound casual, as if this was just another item on his weekly to-do list. "Your mother and I have recently finalized our will, and we thought it was only fair to share the details now, so there are no surprises later." I didn't say anything. I just nodded slowly, even smiled a little, trying to keep the knot in my stomach from showing on my face. I'd never cared much about inheritance. I'd always assumed whatever they had would be divided fairly, maybe a third each. I certainly wasn't expecting a parade or a prize. But what I was about to hear didn't just surprise me. It split something clean down the middle inside me. "We've decided," my mother said, her voice as bright as ever, "that the house, our savings, and all financial assets will be divided between Kelsey and David." Just like that. No build-up. No explanation. No pretense of fairness. I stared at her for a moment, thinking maybe I'd misheard her. Maybe there was more coming. Maybe she was going to say, "And Laura, we've set up a trust for you," or, "And Laura, we've already compensated you in other ways." But no, nothing. Just that plastic smile and the echo of words that didn't belong in a family gathering. My hands felt cold. My heart started beating in that sharp, hollow way it does when you realize you're not even part of the conversation. You're just background noise in someone else's script. I didn't speak, not yet. I just listened as David nodded like it was the most reasonable thing in the world, and Kelsey beamed like she'd just won a goddamn prize on a game show. No one even looked in my direction. No one mentioned the fact that I'd been the one paying their utility bills for the last 6 years. That I'd been the one covering Mom's prescription costs when Medicare fell short. That I'd loaned them money, without interest, without hesitation, when the house nearly fell into foreclosure back in 2019. That I'd picked up groceries, driven them to appointments, repaired plumbing, shoveled their snow, and quietly stepped in every time they started to wobble. I'd never asked for anything in return. Not a dime. Not recognition. Not even a thank you. But now I realized something far worse than being unappreciated. I was disposable. Unnecessary. An afterthought. And that, somehow, was even more painful than outright cruelty. Then came the final gut punch, the one that still rings in my ears like a bell that won't stop tolling. My mother reached across the table, gently patted my hand, and said with syrupy calm, "We know you understand." You've always been the strong one. And in that moment, I realized just how much they'd relied on my strength, not out of respect, not out of love, but because they assumed I'd never need anything from them in return. Because strong people don't need fairness. Strong people don't need inheritance. Strong people don't break. But what they forgot is that even the strongest people eventually stop holding things up, especially when they finally realize they've been holding everyone else while no one's ever had their back. There's a quiet kind of rage that doesn't come with screaming or slamming doors or broken plates on the kitchen floor. It settles in your bones instead, silent and steady. Like cold water rising inch by inch until suddenly you realize it's up to your neck, and you've been drowning in it for years without ever calling it what it was. That's what I felt in the days after that so-called family gathering, the one where my parents sat me down just to tell me that everything I'd ever helped them hold together, every bill, every emergency, every time I picked up the pieces they refused to admit were broken, meant nothing in the end. And I didn't fight back, not then. I didn't scream. I didn't lecture. I didn't demand answers. I just went home and started counting. Not emotionally, not metaphorically. I mean, I actually sat down at my kitchen table with a notepad and a pen, and I started adding it all up. Every grocery run I'd covered when they were a little tight this month. Every phone bill that mysteriously got paid when theirs was about to get cut off. Every time the electricity was about to go off and I stepped in like the dependable daughter I was trained to be. I dug through old bank statements, cross-referenced text messages, and combed through my emails until I had a total that made me physically sick to see in ink. It wasn't just money, it was years of my life, chipped away one favor at a time, while they applauded Kelsey for remembering birthdays and praised David for showing up once a year with a bottle of wine and a 5-minute conversation. And still, I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. I didn't call to confront them. I didn't ask for anything back. I didn't tell them I was hurt or bitter or angry beyond belief. I just stopped. I stopped paying the water bill. I stopped sending money for prescriptions. I stopped logging into the mortgage portal and covering the monthly shortfall they never even thanked me for. I didn't announce it. I didn't make a scene. I just let the silence speak for me. Because sometimes silence is the only language people really understand. Have you ever reached a point where your silence became the only language they'd understand? Ever stopped explaining just to see what happened when they finally noticed you weren't carrying them anymore? Because I had. I reached it like a ledge, toes curled over the edge, and then I jumped. And you know what I found? Not a free fall, but a quiet, liberating kind of peace. 2 weeks passed before the first signs of panic started to bubble through the surface. I could feel it like a shift in the air. My mother's tone changed in her voicemails, less sweet, more strained. The messages started coming more often, little nudges disguised as casual conversation. Hey, sweetie, I noticed the gas bill didn't go through. Was there a glitch? Or, your father thought maybe you forgot to send the usual transfer this month. Each message was coded in the same condescending tone they'd always used with me, as if I were just a little forgetful, just a little off balance, but still reliable enough to clean up the mess behind the curtain. I didn't answer. I just listened. And with every passing day, I watched the cracks form. Then came the real sign of unraveling. One morning, just as I was sipping my coffee and watching the sun stretch across my backyard, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. Not a greeting, not a question, just a single line. The mortgage is due again, honey. Can you handle it today? I stared at that message for a long time, letting the absurdity of it wash over me like warm bathwater. No context, no apology, no acknowledgement that 2 weeks earlier, they'd told me to my face that I wasn't part of their future. And yet here she was, still treating me like the family ATM, still assuming I'd pick up the tab while they handed the keys to someone else. I set my phone down slowly, a smile curling at the corner of my mouth, not a joyful smile, not a triumphant one, but the kind of grin you give yourself when you finally realize you don't owe anyone anything anymore. Not explanations. Not excuses. Not one more goddamn cent. I didn't reply right away. I wanted to let that silence hang in the air just a little longer. Because this time, it was going to speak louder than anything I could ever say. There's something deeply satisfying about saying no for the first time when you've spent your entire life saying yes. Something so unexpectedly powerful about drawing that first boundary line in the sand and watching the people who built their comfort on your compliance suddenly stumble over it like they've never seen it before. I stared at my mother's message, those 10 little words, so casual and entitled, "The mortgage is due again, honey. Can you handle it today?" And I realized with perfect clarity that this was the moment. Not a dramatic confrontation. Not a blowout fight. Just a quiet, precise turning point that would change everything. I typed my reply slowly, savoring each letter, making sure it carried the full weight of what I wasn't going to say out loud anymore. "I think that's something you'll have to figure out." That was it. No explanation. No apology. No offer of a later date or a temporary loan or a warm little hug of reassurance to cushion the blow. Just a single, cold truth, wrapped in the politeness of a sentence that made it very clear I was no longer playing my part in their carefully scripted family drama. I hit send and set the phone down without a second thought. It felt like breathing fresh air for the first time in months, maybe years. I didn't pace the room wondering what they'd say next. I didn't stare at the screen waiting for a reply. I just poured myself another cup of coffee, stepped out into my backyard, and let the silence settle around me like a soft blanket. It was mine now, and I wasn't giving it up for anyone. But the silence didn't last long. Within an hour, my phone started buzzing like a hornet's nest. First, there was a call from my mother that I didn't answer. Then a follow-up text, a little less polite this time. "Laura, I don't understand what's going on. Did something happen? Please call me." I ignored that too. 10 minutes later, another message came through, this time in the family group chat that had been dead for weeks. Kelsey, predictably, was the first to jump in. Mom says you're refusing to help with the mortgage? What the hell is going on?" I didn't answer. Let them squirm a little. Let them wonder. Then came David, ever the voice of cold logic and condescension. "If this is some kind of reaction to the will, it's childish. We all agreed it was the most efficient solution. Don't make this personal." And that's when I knew none of them had ever really seen me clearly. Because if they had, they'd know that silence wasn't weakness. It was a warning. I didn't reply in the group chat. Instead, I sent one private message to David. "Funny how you call it childish when you've never lifted a finger to help them with anything that didn't involve a check from their estate." He didn't respond. Kelsey, meanwhile, kept spamming the thread like she was hosting a one-woman panic show. "This is going to ruin everything. Mom is freaking out. She says the utility company is threatening to shut off the water. Are you really going to let that happen?" Yes, I thought. I really am. Then the guilt tripping started in earnest. My mother, bless her manipulative little heart, sent a string of texts designed to hit every emotional trigger I'd been conditioned to respond to since childhood. "We didn't mean to hurt you. We thought you'd understand. You've always been so strong, so independent. You've never needed anything from us. That's why we thought you'd be okay. Please don't let this tear us apart." I stared at those messages for a long time, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel responsible. I didn't feel obligated to make her feel better about her decisions or mine. Because the truth is, I'd been raised to believe that being the strong one meant swallowing every insult, covering every cost, and never daring to ask for recognition. But now, for the first time, I was redefining what strength meant. And it wasn't silence. It was self-respect. Still, I knew my mother wasn't done. She never stopped at words when they didn't work. And sure enough, that evening, just as the sun was dipping behind the trees and I was settling into the rare peace of a guilt-free day, my phone rang again, this time, a voicemail from my father. I hadn't heard his voice in months, not directly. Not unless he was parroting something Mom had asked him to say. His message was short, softer than I expected, and oddly hesitant. "Hey, Laura. I think you should call your mother. She's not sleeping. She's really upset." I sat in silence, staring at the screen, listening to the weight of a man who knew damn well what was happening, but still couldn't bring himself to choose a side. Not really. I didn't call back. Not yet. Because they weren't losing sleep over what they did to me. They were losing sleep because I finally stopped pretending it didn't matter. There's a strange sort of clarity that settles in once the dust starts to clear, when the noise quiets and you stop reacting out of habit and finally start remembering. Not just recent wounds, but the old ones, the ones you buried so deep you forgot they were still bleeding beneath the surface. In the days after my father's voicemail, I didn't feel guilt, I didn't feel regret, I didn't even feel particularly angry anymore. What I felt was something colder and sharper, something that came from deep within the years I'd spent trying to earn a seat at a table I was never really welcome at in the first place. It wasn't just the will or the money or the bills. It was the realization that none of this was new. It had always been this way. I had just finally stopped pretending it wasn't. I started remembering things I hadn't thought about in years, snippets of conversations, quiet moments from childhood, all the little ways I had been molded into the one who always held the weight while everyone else got to play fragile and needy. I remembered being 10 years old, staying up late to help my mother clean the kitchen while Kelsey wandered off to her room because she was tired. I remembered how Dad used to praise David for mowing the lawn once a month while I was the one organizing their mail, managing their doctor's appointments, packing their suitcases when they traveled. I remembered Kelsey getting away with skipped classes and broken curfews because she was just a little overwhelmed, while I was the one getting scolded for not helping more with the family holiday planning. And then there was that one conversation that suddenly came back to me so vividly I could practically hear my mother's voice in the room with me, her hand resting gently on my shoulder as she said it with that soft, patronizing tone she'd perfected over the years. I must have been in college at the time, home for a weekend, quietly fuming because Kelsey had just blown off another family obligation, and somehow I was the one cleaning up the mess. I asked Mom why Kelsey always got a pass, why nobody seemed to expect anything from her. She smiled at me like I was too young to understand the world, even though I was already paying half their bills back then, and said, "Sweetheart, Kelsey needs more support. She's sensitive. You're a rock. We count on you." I remember swallowing that answer like a stone, trying to believe it was a compliment when it felt more like a sentence. That was the blueprint they handed me. Not a child. Not a daughter. A tool. A fixture. A dependable cog in the family machine who never breaks down, never needs repair, and never asks why it's the only one doing all the work. And now, years later, I finally saw it for what it really was. This was never about fairness. It was never about gratitude or love or even logic. It was about control. It was about knowing that as long as I stayed in my place, strong, quiet, selfless, they never had to face the discomfort of their own selfishness. They never had to carry the burden of their choices because I was always there to shoulder the consequences. They didn't leave me out of the will because they thought I didn't need anything. They left me out because they never planned to give me anything to begin with. Because in their minds, I didn't require compensation, I was already bought and paid for in loyalty and silence. But not anymore. That Saturday morning, just after I'd finished watering the plants and was about to settle down with a book, I heard a knock at the door. It was soft, hesitant, the kind of knock that comes from someone who knows they shouldn't be standing there. I opened it, and there she was, my mother. No warning, no phone call, just her standing on my porch with a face full of practiced sorrow and a checkbook clutched in her trembling hands. "I just want to talk," she said, voice already cracking with the kind of tears she used like currency. "Please, Laura. Just tell me what you want." She looked so small standing there, so desperate and unfamiliar, like someone who'd finally realized the leash she thought she held wasn't attached to anything anymore. And I stood there for a moment, just long enough to let the weight of that question settle in, just long enough to let her feel what it was like to be the one on the outside of the conversation. Because the truth is, I didn't want anything. Not from her. Not anymore. There's a unique kind of calm that comes over you when you've already made peace with walking away, when you've finally accepted that not every relationship deserves your energy just because it's wrapped in the label of family. So when I opened the door wider and told my mother to come in, it wasn't out of softness or hope or even courtesy. It was simply because I wanted to watch her hear the truth while sitting face to face with everything she had so casually dismissed for decades. I led her into the kitchen with the same quiet grace I'd used my whole life, the kind they'd always mistaken for obedience, but was really just restraint, and while the kettle heated on the stove, she sat at the dining table like a stranger in a house she used to control. I poured her tea in the same floral-patterned mug she'd given me for my 35th birthday, the one she'd wrapped in tissue paper and handed to me with a distracted smile while gushing over the diamond bracelet she'd just gifted Kelsey for no reason at all. I placed it in front of her without a word and sat across from her, letting the silence hang for a moment longer than was comfortable. She looked tired, older than I remembered, but part of me wondered if that was just because I was seeing her clearly now, without the haze of obligation and guilt clouding my view. "I'm not angry anymore," I said finally, and her eyes flicked up to meet mine, already brimming with tears like she'd been rehearsing this moment in the mirror all morning. "I just think you should understand the math of it." She blinked, confused, and I pulled out a small stack of papers I'd kept in the kitchen drawer, just a simple list, handwritten and itemized, not for her benefit, but because I'd needed to see it for myself. I laid them in front of her and watched her eyes scan each line slowly. Mortgage payments, 42 in total. Prescription costs, monthly, for 6 years. Utility bills, food deliveries, house repairs, emergency plumber visits, insurance gaps, new tires for Dad's car, winter coats when they couldn't afford them, dental visits, groceries during the pandemic. And even the damn cable subscription when they didn't want to cancel HBO. Her face began to pale as the total accumulated in her head, and I could almost hear the sound of her pride cracking beneath the weight of numbers she'd never bothered to ask about. "You kept all this?" she whispered, and I nodded, not out of bitterness, but because it had become the only way I could remember I hadn't imagined the years I'd poured into holding their lives together while they handed praise and preference to my siblings like party favors. "I didn't keep it to shame you," I said quietly. "I kept it to remind myself that I wasn't crazy. That I wasn't imagining how much I gave while you kept asking for more." She reached for the checkbook again, sliding it forward like it was some kind of peace offering, her hands trembling just enough to betray how fragile this performance of humility really was. "You tell me the number," she said softly, "and I'll write it right now." "I swear, Laura. I didn't know you felt this way." I pushed it back toward her without hesitation, my hands steady and my voice even. "You can't buy me now," I said, not cruelly, not even coldly, just firmly, like someone who's already paid the bill in full. "That price expired years ago." She looked up at me with something like heartbreak, but I could see in her eyes that it wasn't grief over what she'd done, it was fear that she'd lost control, that her dependable daughter was no longer willing to carry the weight of their comfort without question. And then, as if the confession had been burning a hole in her gut, she finally let it out in one long breath. "It wasn't about love," she said. "The will, it wasn't because we didn't love you. It was just easier that way. You've always been steady. David would have thrown a tantrum if we left him less. Kelsey would have taken it personally. We didn't want to deal with that. There it was. The truth in its most pathetic form, not a strategy, not a plan, just fear and convenience wrapped in a parent's cowardice. They didn't choose my siblings because they deserved more. They chose them because I was the one least likely to make noise, to cause trouble, to push back against the decision. They took my silence as compliance, and they bet their comfort on the assumption that I'd always keep giving just to keep the peace. "Well," I said, leaning back in my chair and smiling, "now there's conflict. Let them fix it." And I meant it. Let David figure out how to cover the mortgage now that I wasn't quietly filling in the gaps. Let Kelsey call the utility companies and explain the late fees. Let them play the role of responsible children for once, now that they'd been handed everything they never earned. As for me, I'd stopped playing that part. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty about it. There's a difference between walking away out of anger and walking away because you've finally found peace in the distance, a quiet satisfaction in no longer bending yourself in half for people who never once thought to ask if you were breaking. After my mother left that day, checkbook untouched, excuses unraveling behind her like a threadbare scarf, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't even talk to anyone about it. I simply went back to my own life, the one I had spent years putting on hold while they drained me in the name of duty. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, my calendar wasn't filled with reminders to transfer money or make appointments or check in on the status of someone else's comfort. It was just mine, empty, clean, quiet. And with all that silence, all that stillness, I finally had space to think clearly about what I wanted next. The money I used to spend on mortgage gaps and prescription copays and surprise repairs, I started funneling that into something tangible, something that belonged to me and no one else. I met with a real estate agent, started researching rental properties, ran the numbers like I was preparing for war, not out of vengeance, but out of survival. It was the first time I'd invested in something that wouldn't eventually ask me to fade into the background. I bought a modest duplex across town, nothing flashy, but solid, profitable, stable. Something I could build on, something that gave me choices. Something my parents never thought I needed because they never imagined a world where I'd choose myself over them. Meanwhile, their world started crumbling piece by piece in exactly the way they'd never expected. The house, the one they'd so proudly left to my siblings in the will, was on the verge of foreclosure within 3 months. The bank notices started piling up. The property taxes went unpaid. The utilities, gas, water, electric, began cycling through disconnection warnings. And it was only then, only when the financial burden became visible, undeniable, unmanageable, that David and Kelsey began to realize just how much had been quietly held together by the sister they had so casually erased from the family legacy. I didn't have to lift a finger. I didn't have to say a word. The numbers spoke for themselves. The chaos unfolded in the background while I painted my kitchen walls a new shade of sage green and ran open house viewings on weekends for prospective tenants. Kelsey tried calling once, her voice sharp and panicked and laced with a bitterness she didn't even try to hide. "You could have just said something," she snapped into the voicemail, instead of letting everything fall apart. I didn't respond. Because that's the thing people like her never understand. It didn't fall apart. It just finally stopped pretending to work. Even David, ever the polished one, eventually cracked. I got an email from him, formal and cold, asking if I'd reconsider helping, just until things stabilize, as if I were a bank account with a heartbeat, waiting to be tapped again now that the ones they chose had failed to deliver. I didn't reply to him either. Some things don't deserve responses anymore, not when they come too late and only out of desperation. And then, like a final act in a slow-burning play, I received the message I'd always known was coming. It came on a Thursday afternoon, just as I was pouring a glass of wine and reviewing lease agreements for my next property. The screen lit up with a text from my mother, simple and perfectly on brand. "We're selling the house. We hope you'll come visit wherever we end up." No apology. No reflection. Just another attempt to keep the door cracked open, just wide enough for me to come back in and start carrying the weight again. I stared at the message for a long time, watching the words flicker across the screen, and then, without a second thought, I hit delete. No response. No emotion. Just silence. And maybe that's what peace looks like in the end. Not fireworks or speeches or dramatic closure, but a quiet refusal to re-engage with people who only ever valued you for what you gave, not for who you were. Maybe it wasn't revenge at all. Maybe it was simply reclamation. But still, I wonder sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the wine has gone a little warm in the glass. Did I win? Or did I just walk away from the only family I ever had, trading one kind of pain for another, a cleaner pain, a quieter one, but still pain all the same? Maybe that's the real cost of silence, not the loss of love, but the realization that it was never love in the first place. Just expectation, performance, obligation, wrapped in a ribbon and called family. And maybe that's the most bitter freedom of all.